Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for May 2nd, 2023. Well, over this last weekend, we experienced the second largest banking collapse in U.S. history when First Republic Bank was taken over by regulators and then sold off, whittled down with the FDIC assuming a lot of the bad paper. It was taken over by JP Chase. First Republic had collapsed in its share price from over $140 per share down to less than $2 per share before it was taken over. This means JP Chase will assume all deposits and assets. The deposits are $103 billion that's still left, although $100 billion fled the bank in the run-up to the collapse. And their total assets is $229 billion, but no one's sure how much of that is actually tangible value and how much is just worthless paper. Now, it's worth taking a quick look at the history of the Morgan Bank to get a sense of what we're dealing with here. And we go back to the panic of 1907, when there was a run on the banks. And this was driven by the consolidation of trusts and monopolies. In fact, some think that J.P. Morgan himself may have played a role in triggering the run on the banks. But what happened in October of 1907 is that Morgan pulled together a consortium with Morgan Bank, First National Bank, and National City Bank to make $1 million each in loans to bail out two failing banks. Eventually, $6 million in total was pulled together, led by J.P. Morgan. And then as the banks failed, as was intended, because the money was not enough to keep the banks going, just as the $30 billion that was pulled together for First Republic a month ago didn't keep that bank solvent. When the banks failed, Morgan moved in and grabbed them. He pulled together a pool of $30 million, which included a $10 million check from John D. Rockefeller. And they took over not only banks, but manufacturing firms, telecommunications firms, mining and transport companies. Now, in the wake of this so-called panic of 2007 and the role Morgan played in the bailout, he pulled together a force to make the United States adopt a new central banking system. And this is the background to what happened 6 years later in 1913 with the creation of the Federal Reserve. This was largely triggered by the Morgan response to the panic of 1907, which, as I say, some historians think Morgan himself triggered. Now, it didn't stop with the founding of the Federal Reserve. If you look at Chase and Morgan, you see a parallel history of moving in and grabbing banks as they become bigger and bigger and bigger. In 1955, Chase National Bank merged with the Bank of Manhattan Company to become Chase Manhattan Bank. In 1991, Chemical Bank and Manufacturers Hanover, two of the largest six banks of the country, were damaged by real estate loans, third world debt, and so on. So they merged in 91. In 95, Chemical Bank, which was the merged bank, merged with Chase Manhattan Bank. And then in 2000, J.P. Morgan merged with Chase Manhattan Corporation. In 2004, Morgan Chase took over Bank One. And then in 2008, during the financial crisis, Morgan Chase bought Washington Mutual, which at the time was the largest, I think it still is the largest bank collapse in U.S. history. Now, as this is going on in the present period, we're seeing a tremendous weakness in the banking sector overall, which reflects the collapse of the physical economy, which I'll get to in a moment. But we should take note that Biden issued an executive order on July 9th, 2021, which he said would guard against excessive market power and enforce antitrust laws. And what he wrote is that there would be revitalization of merger oversight under the Bank Merger Act and the Bank Holding Company Act of 1956. Now, what's clear is that Biden's policy to prevent against banks becoming too big has had no effect, because when the so-called too big to fail banks or systemically important financial institutions, SIFIs, the whole idea is that if they're going to collapse, it's the whole system that's coming down. Therefore, what's remaining in the system, namely bailout capabilities of the FDIC, which is funded by the government, and the Federal Reserve, which is essentially a repository of money of the private banks, that the funds will be made available to bail out the banks, the biggest banks, but not necessarily the depositors. Now, there's a real question as to what's going to happen with the deposits in these banks that are being taken over. But in the last 16 years, the Fed has approved over 4,500 bank mergers. So this gives you a sense of what's going on and how toothless Biden's claim that he's going to reinvigorate oversight on the banks, how it really doesn't function. Now, then let's take a look at what J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon had to say about this current takeover. What he said is that we're clearly going to see some reduction in bank lending, basically saying that the problem is that the banks are loaning money, too much money, to the economy. Now, who are they loaning money to? To failed corporations, to bankrupt institutions. And they're doing that to protect the nominal face value on the paper held by these institutions, which are backed by nothing. Nothing. This is a funny money system in which the quantitative easing policy of the Federal Reserve has turned on the printing presses. From after the 2008 crash, after the 2019 constriction of credit, the inability of banks to make money available to their zombie corporation clients. So what happened is the federal government stepped in as a backstop with the Federal Reserve pumping out money, and then institutions such as the FDIC cleaning up the mess and then giving the legitimate assets to the big banks like J.P. Morgan Chase. So Dimon said on yesterday, we are clearly going to see some reduction in bank lending. This has been going on for a long time. Then he went on to say, we need large, successful banks in the largest economy. And what Zero Hedge said in writing about this is that once the banks are pushed into the FDIC hands, the assets will be scooped up by J.P. Morgan Chase with government backstops. And Zero Hedge then said what this really means is we, J.P. Morgan, will wait for the bank run to cripple the banks, then buy them all for cents on the dollar with the FDIC keeping the toxic crap, unquote, from Zero Hedge. Now, this is a disaster because what's necessary is to reorganize the bankrupt banks and corporations, write down the debt, write off the debt. It's never going to be collected, but in the meantime, in order to keep it alive on the books so banks can keep trading the toxic paper and making money on it, in order to do that, they're pumping out more and more liquidity. But this is just highlights the difference between liquidity and solvency. All the liquidity in the world will not save an insolvent bank if the financial system is there to make sure that the casino speculation remains, but the physical production of wealth is not invested in. As Dimon said, there'll be a reduction of credit. So what we need is Glass-Steagall and LaRouche's 4 laws. We've talked about that a lot. I'm going to be linking in the description section a full explanation of what that would mean by Jason Ross from the Executive Intelligence Review, which you can read and get a real sense of the difference between a serious approach to economy and the fraudulent one, which is largely a protection of the speculators and the swindlers by our present system, which is the government as a part of it, but it's driven by the private banks that control the Federal Reserve and the world's central banks. Now, meanwhile, the war drive is continuing. There's an escalation. The word is no negotiations. Kiev will keep fighting and we'll keep arming them. Following the talks between Zelensky and China's President Xi, which indicated the possibility that Ukraine, because of its degraded status of its military, might seek a negotiated settlement, once again, a team of Brits were sent in to stiffen the spine of the Ukrainians. This time it was led by former MI6 director Sir Richard Dearloffe and a handful of others from the parliament who basically said, we'll give you more weapons, we'll give you the long-range missiles, but you must keep fighting to the last Ukrainian. And so they said you must reject Xi's offer unless Xi turns against Russia. So I'll have more on the escalation of the war tomorrow. Read Jason's article to get a real sense of the difference between sound economic thinking, physical economy, and the funny money system, the casino system, which is blowing out today, which is eating up your savings, your future, while people like Jamie Dimon become billionaires. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.